I sat there in the courtroom, hands folded in my lap, trying to keep my breathing steady while the woman I once called my wife painted me as some kind of opportunist. Alexa stood tall in her sharp suit, her voice steady, polished, as she pointed at me across the room and accused me of marrying her for money. Her lawyer, Chad Langston, the same man she'd been sleeping with behind my back for the better part of a year, stood next to her like a smug statue, completely sure of the narrative they had rehearsed. They expected this to be clean, make me look like a leech, walk away with everything, and leave me with nothing but a ruined name. But then the judge raised a single eyebrow and asked, "So, Mrs. Monroe, a man earning over $540,000 a year, is a gold digger?" The words echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Alexis's face dropped, just for a second, like someone pulled the floor from under her. She didn't know. That's the part that still makes me laugh when I think about it. She didn't know a damn thing. I kept my business quiet for a reason. When we first got married, she made it very clear that she didn't want me involved in her work. "Stay in your lane," she said, and I did. My lane just happened to be investing. Startups, real estate, crypto before the hype. I didn't talk about my success. I didn't need to. While she was busy with her board meetings and press conferences, I was building something real, quietly, steadily, with no need for applause. And now, here she was, trying to bury me publicly, thinking she was the one holding the grenade, only to realize I had already pulled the pin. When my attorney stood up and handed over the portfolio, the statements, the contracts, the asset logs, you could hear the shuffle of the courtroom leaning in. Alexis didn't speak. She didn't even blink. Maybe she thought it was some bluff. But when the judge started flipping through the documents, the change in his tone said it all. This wasn't a man grasping for a fortune. This was a man who didn't need a damn cent from her. It was 13 years ago when I first met Alexis Monroe at a fundraiser in downtown Seattle. One of those sleek, over-polished events filled with overpriced wine, curated smiles, and more ambition in the air than oxygen. I wasn't supposed to be there. Not really. I got the invite through a client who couldn't make it and passed it along as a favor. I was a mid-level financial analyst back then, pulling in around $85,000 a year. Nothing spectacular, but stable, steady. I didn't own cufflinks worth a month's rent like most of the men there, and I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just stood near the back, drink in hand, watching the room move like a well-rehearsed performance. And then she walked in. Alexis didn't just enter a room. She took it. That night she was in a navy blue dress that looked custom, hair pulled back, heels clicking like punctuation marks. People parted for her, without her asking, without her even looking. Everyone knew who she was. Alexis Monroe, the daughter of James Monroe, the man behind Monroe Strategies, one of the fastest-growing tech consultancies in the country. But she wasn't writing her father's name. Even then, she was already becoming the force behind it. Somehow, despite every more qualified man in the room waiting for a chance to orbit her, she ended up talking to me. It started with a joke about how most of the donors cared more about being seen than who they were raising money for. She laughed, not a polite giggle, but a real, quick laugh that told me she appreciated honesty more than showmanship. We talked for hours that night about market trends, company valuations, exit strategies. She was sharp, fast, and absolutely unforgiving when it came to weakness in business. I admired it. We fell together fast after that. The relationship moved like she did. No wasted time, no second guessing. We were married within a year, surrounded by a carefully selected crowd, most of them from her side. The ceremony was elegant, expensive, cold. She orchestrated it like a corporate merger, efficient, impressive, but not intimate. I didn't mind. I loved her, or at least I loved the version of her I thought I understood. Once we were married, her rise through Monroe Strategies was even faster. She crushed quarterly projections, reorganized teams, pushed innovations that doubled revenue. By the time she took the CEO role, no one even mentioned her father anymore. She was a face now, the power, the brand. And me? I slipped into the role she needed. Quiet support. I handled the home, the logistics, the numbers behind the scenes. I managed our taxes, oversaw investments, adjusted our spending based on her bonuses and RSUs. She liked things neat, controlled, and free from interference. I gave her that. I didn't argue when she took late meetings or traveled for weeks at a time. I didn't push to be part of her business life because I knew the truth. Alexis only made space for one star in a room, and it was always going to be her. She didn't want a partner in the spotlight. She wanted someone who would keep the lights on at home, manage the spreadsheets, keep quiet. So I did. But behind that quiet, I wasn't idle. I watched. I learned. I built. And while she saw me as a man in the background, I was laying foundations she never cared to ask about. The first 6 years of our marriage felt like something out of a magazine spread. We bought the house in Oak Hill Ridge, one of those gated communities where the driveways are wider than some city streets, and the houses sit on top of manicured hills like they're too good to touch the ground. It had 7 bedrooms, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a wine cellar we never used. We hosted parties with caterers and valet parking. People in designer clothes sipping champagne in our living room while ambient jazz floated in the background. On paper, we were the perfect couple, Alexis, the powerhouse CEO, and me, the supportive husband who always made sure things ran smoothly behind the scenes. We vacationed in Cabo, chartered yachts, spent weekends in Napa. Every detail was curated, every moment staged like a highlight reel. But as Alexis's career kept rising, something in her shifted. At first, it was subtle. She stopped asking about my day. I'd tell her about property I was closing on or a new investment I was analyzing, and she'd nod without really listening, already reaching for her phone or scanning emails. She used to light up when we talked, challenge me on my ideas, ask questions. But now, it felt like I was speaking into an empty room. Then came the late nights. She started saying she had to stay longer at the office, meetings running over, board members needing her attention. At first, I believed her. She was always busy, and the pressure on her was real. But then the excuses started sounding rehearsed, the details too vague. She'd come home at midnight, sometimes later, makeup still fresh, hair too perfect for someone who'd supposedly been stuck in a boardroom all evening. The distance between us grew, and I felt it every time she looked through me instead of at me. She became colder, more mechanical. Our conversation shrank down to logistics. What day was the dinner party? Had I confirmed the housekeeper? Was the wine stocked? My name on her lips started to sound like an afterthought. I started noticing things. Her phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, was now always face down or locked in her purse. She took calls in the other room and would lower her voice if I walked by. There were texts at odd hours, messages she'd quickly clear. I remember the first time I caught the scent, cologne that wasn't mine clinging faintly to her coat when she came in one night. It wasn't subtle, not the kind you pick up in passing. It was the kind that lingers when someone's been close. Too close. And then there was the man. I saw him the first time at a gallery opening we attended together. She introduced him as a legal consultant helping with new corporate acquisitions. His name was Chad Langston. He was polished, loud in a quiet way, the kind of guy who smiled too wide and kept one hand in his pocket like he was hiding something. I didn't like the way he looked at her, like he already knew more than he should. Over the next few months, he showed up everywhere, always just behind her, always available, always laughing too hard at her jokes. And Alexis never mentioned it, never said why he was suddenly everywhere she was, never asked if I noticed. I did. I noticed all of it. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask. I just watched. I observed the silences, the lies tucked between smiles, the way she stopped saying my name the same way she used to. And in that quiet space where my wife had once been, suspicion started to bloom. Quiet, steady, undeniable. The night of the Monroe Strategies annual gala was one of those events Alexis never let me skip, no matter how strained things had become between us. She said it was important for appearances, that the board liked to see a strong front, that image still mattered. I wore the tailored suit she picked out weeks in advance, the one she said brought out my shoulders, and smiled to the rehearsed greetings, the hollow compliments, and the artificial laughter bouncing off crystal chandeliers. But the moment we walked into that ballroom, I could already feel the shift in her. She detached from me the second we passed coat check, her hand slipping from mine, as she was swept into a crowd of executives and investors. I followed at a polite distance, knowing the routine by now. She'd make the rounds, pose for photographers, and I'd stay somewhere near the edge, quietly being whatever version of a husband she needed that night. And then there he was, Chad Langston, her so-called corporate attorney. I'd seen him before, at meetings, events, casual lunches that weren't supposed to mean anything. But that night, something was different. He was wearing a tux that fit a little too well, standing too close, laughing at things she didn't even try to make funny. The way his hand brushed her lower back as they moved through the room. The way she leaned into him as if the crowd didn't exist. It wasn't professional, it wasn't subtle, and it wasn't new. I stood there, drink in hand, watching my wife flirt with another man in a room filled with her employees, board members, and clients. as if she didn't care who noticed. The touches were soft but deliberate, the kind that didn't happen by accident. When she whispered something in his ear, and he smiled like he'd already heard it before, I stopped hearing the music altogether. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just being paranoid. It wasn't just late nights and unfamiliar cologne. It was real, but I didn't confront her. I didn't walk across the ballroom and make a scene. That wasn't my style. Instead, I turned away, made polite conversation with someone from operations, then slipped out early without saying goodbye. The cold air outside hit harder than expected, and by the time I got home, my chest felt like it was full of glass. I poured myself a drink, something expensive I had been saving for a quiet victory that never came. I stood by the window of our perfect home and stared out into the dark, trying to breathe through the weight pressing down on my ribs. And then, without thinking too much, I picked up my phone and dialed a number I never thought I'd use. It rang twice before a voice answered, professional and sharp. I gave him my name and said I needed to know everything. If she was going to lie to my face, I wanted the truth delivered to my doorstep. I wanted proof. 6 months before Alexis ever mentioned divorce, before the distance between us solidified into silence and contempt, I quietly opened the door to a new chapter of my life, one she never bothered to notice. I launched Mitchell Strategic Advisory in a co-working space downtown, the kind with glass offices and free coffee that tastes like cardboard, surrounded by freelancers, founders, and people grinding without fanfare. It was just me at first, a laptop, a phone, and 2 clients who trusted me enough to move their portfolios over. No press release, no LinkedIn announcement, no hint that anything had changed. I didn't need validation. I needed results. I built it slow, methodically, the way I'd learned to build everything in life, with precision and silence. I tapped into networks she didn't even know I had, used referrals, cold calls, and sheer competence to scale. Within the first quarter, I was managing over $30 million. By the time the second rolled around, the number had tripled. My old contacts from corporate finance began sending me their clients, people who wanted high-yield performance with low drama. I gave them both. I didn't tell Alexis a thing. She still believed I was working the same mid-level role I had when we met, the one she'd long since stopped asking about. I let her believe it. Every morning, I'd leave in a tailored suit and take calls from investors in the parking garage, then walk into my modest office and keep building. By the time the firm passed $500 million in managed assets, I still hadn't said a word. She never asked. When the divorce papers showed up, hand-delivered by a man who couldn't even look me in the eye, I opened them at the kitchen counter. Her offer, if you could call it that, was $50,000, a buyout, as if I was some dependent she had carried out of pity. The language was cold, clinical. It accused me of leeching off her career, of providing no financial contribution to the marriage, of being nothing more than a footnote in her narrative. I read it once, then again, and by the third time, I wasn't angry. I was calm. She had underestimated me so completely, so arrogantly, that it wasn't even insulting, it was useful. She had no idea what I'd built, no clue that Mitchell Strategic Advisory was now managing over $800 million in client assets. No clue that the man she was trying to cut out for pennies had become wealthier, smarter, and far more dangerous than she could imagine. She thought I'd crawl away, maybe fight for crumbs. But I had something better than pride. I had the truth. I had the numbers. I had the receipts. And soon, so would the court. When Darren Cole showed up in my office, he carried the kind of expression only a former detective could wear, calm, detached, and full of quiet disgust. He handed me a thick envelope. No dramatic lead-up, no unnecessary commentary. "It's all in there," he said, then nodded once and left. I waited until the door clicked shut before I reached for the contents. I knew there'd be proof, but I wasn't prepared for just how thorough it was. Inside were photos, dozens of them, taken with the kind of precision that left no room for doubt. Alexis and Chad, entering hotels under separate names but always leaving together, smiling like people who believed the world owed them something. There were timestamps, room numbers, parking garage entries. There were receipts, designer bags, luxury jewelry, first-class plane tickets, all paid for by Chad, who supposedly didn't make enough to justify that kind of spending without help. The way he lavished her with gifts, all while she smiled for corporate interviews about leadership and integrity, was almost laughable. Then came the texts. Darren had pulled records from a burner phone Chad thought was untraceable. I read every word slowly, methodically. It wasn't just infidelity, it was strategic, calculated. They weren't just sneaking around behind my back. They were plotting how to destroy me. In one message, Alexis wrote, "He still thinks I don't know he's coasting on my name. Once we're done, he'll be lucky to walk away with a gym bag and a mattress." Chad replied with a laughing emoji and said, "Let me know when we're pulling the trigger. I'll help draft a 'I'm too broke to fight back' storyline." They talked about me like I was a weak link, a dependent, someone too blind or too soft to realize he was being gutted from the inside out. But I wasn't blind and I wasn't soft. I'd been preparing for this. I didn't let anger control me. Instead, I printed copies of every photo, every message, every financial breadcrumb they left behind. Then I handed it all to Kimberly Alvarez. Kimberly wasn't just my lawyer. She was a tactician, a sharp, relentless force of nature who thrived on cases that turned the tables. She didn't flinch when she read the text. She didn't gasp or curse. She smiled, tight and calculated, and said, "Good. Let's give them exactly what they think they're ready for." Together, we built a counterattack not out of revenge, but precision. Every lie they crafted, every accusation they made in those papers, we buried under evidence and truth. They thought I was cornered. They thought I was naive. They thought I was standing still. But I was 3 moves ahead, and by the time they realized that, it was far too late. The courtroom was packed, and I could feel every set of eyes on me as Chad Langston stood to deliver his opening remarks with all the flair of a man who thought he'd already won. He painted a picture of me as a passive husband, someone who clung to the coattails of a powerful woman, benefited from her status, and now, after the marriage ended, wanted a piece of something he never built. It was theatrical, dramatic, filled with just enough legal polish to sound legitimate. I sat there quietly, watching Alexis nod along beside him, smug in her certainty, while the whispers in the gallery leaned her way. The performance was flawless, if you didn't know the truth, but I did, and so did Kimberly Alvarez. When she rose, there was no showmanship, no exaggerated tone, just confidence. She walked to the bench and submitted a stack of documents, my tax returns, business registrations, quarterly reports, client contracts, and bank statements. All neatly tabbed, all verified. There was no need to embellish. The numbers spoke for themselves. She laid out my income from Mitchell Strategic Advisory, showing that I had brought in $547,000 in the previous fiscal year, with a projected increase based on our current asset performance. The room shifted, quietly but definitively. Even the judge raised an eyebrow as he scanned the figures. Then Kimberly turned to Alexis and asked, "At what point, Mrs. Monroe, did you become aware that your husband was earning over $500,000 annually?" Alexis blinked. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. I watched the color drain from her face, the certainty evaporate. That moment, the exact second her narrative began to collapse, was something I'll never forget. She had walked into court expecting to bury me with accusations, but now she was exposed as someone who had no idea what her own husband was truly worth. And that was only the beginning. Kimberly handed the next folder to the judge, photographs, text logs, and financial statements. The evidence was laid out clearly. Alexis's ongoing affair with Chad, their hotel stays, expensive gifts, and worst of all, their deliberate effort to misrepresent my finances to strip me of any fair settlement. Kimberly read aloud the text where they mocked me, planned to discredit my business, and referred to me as the dead weight with credit score. Gasps moved through the room, but it didn't stop there. Kimberly pointed out the direct ethical violations, how Chad, acting as Alexis's legal counsel, had been romantically involved with his client throughout the proceedings, a blatant conflict of interest. She submitted the receipts, the timelines, the overlaps between professional duties and personal misconduct. The judge didn't hesitate. He removed Chad from the case immediately and ordered an inquiry into potential legal malpractice. Chad didn't argue. His jaw was tight, but he said nothing as he collected his notes and walked out without looking at anyone. Alexis, left without her counsel and stripped of her narrative, sat frozen. Her composure broke when the judge stated that the court would be reviewing every financial claim she had made under oath. She started crying, real, ugly, uncontrolled sobbing, in front of her legal team, the press seat in the back, and 2 members of her board who had shown up to support her. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just sat still, knowing the truth had finally spoken louder than their lies. 3 weeks after the courtroom unraveling, everything was finalized. I walked away with full ownership of Mitchell Strategic Advisory, my entire investment portfolio untouched, and a 7-figure settlement that felt less like compensation and more like a quiet acknowledgement of everything she had tried to erase. Alexis got to keep the mansion in Oak Hill Ridge, the one she used to parade during interviews as a symbol of her success, and she held on to her company, though not for long without consequences. As soon as the details of the courtroom scandal made their way through business circuits, Monroe's strategies began to bleed. Clients dropped out quietly, a few of them emailing me directly to explore other options. Her name, once bulletproof in tech consulting circles, became something people only whispered about, followed by phrases like conflict of interest and internal misconduct. Chad Langston resigned from his firm 2 days after the judge's order, and within a week, he'd relocated to Arizona. No statement, no interview, just silence and disgrace. It was the kind of exit reserved for people who know they've been exposed beyond repair. I didn't celebrate. I didn't throw a party or make some public declaration. Instead, I returned to my office, closed the door, and looked out the skyline from my new penthouse downtown, a space filled with clean lines, quiet corners, and no trace of what used to be. There was peace in that silence, the kind that doesn't come from victory, but from surviving something meant to break you. Months later, I got the call. I almost didn't answer when I saw her name flash across my screen, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was soft, hesitant, the performance stripped away. She didn't apologize outright. People like Alexis rarely do. But her meaning was clear. She wanted to talk, to meet, to see if there was still a version of us that could exist. I let her speak, let her say everything she thought might matter. And when she paused, waiting for me to hand her some emotional lifeline, I gave her the only truth that had lived at the center of all this from the beginning. You never saw me for who I was. That was it. No yelling, no bitterness, just clarity. She hung up a minute later, and I haven't heard from her since. Now I run a billion-dollar firm with offices across 3 states and a waiting list of clients. My days are full, structured, built around purpose instead of damage control. And I'm not alone. Rachel came into my life unexpectedly, a professor of economics with sharp opinions, a quiet brilliance, and no interest in pretense. She listens, she challenges, and more than anything, she sees me. Not the paycheck, not the resume. Me. I don't think about Alexis anymore, not in the way I used to. Occasionally, her name surfaces in articles about leadership scandals or dropped accounts, and when it does, I feel nothing. No rage, no triumph. Just a memory of what happens when people confuse silence for weakness. Because the truth is, revenge doesn't need noise. Sometimes it arrives in the form of facts, evidence, and calm composure. Sometimes it looks like walking away while the other person is still stuck, trying to rewrite a story that never belonged to them.